Do you want to start it?
Okay, I'll start. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. Unlike the last time where Major introduced me, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Darshan. I'm your host. I'm also going to be the guest on today's podcast, and Major's going to keep me on track.
I'm just the guy in the background.
You're the guy who's going to keep me on track, because we both know that I tend to go off track. So this is going to be fun.
So what are we talking about today?
Our goal today is to talk about the transparency case study. We're going to talk about if you are a pharma company with a rare disease portfolio and you want to publish and put out a transparency policy, how do you create a cohesive transparency plan?
You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.
I'm going to give you a 5-step process. Count it, Major. A 5-step process.
It's always 5.
To create a transparency plan. Step 1, and I'm gonna do an unusual thing. I'm gonna first list out the 5, and then we'll discuss each one of them. The first one. First, identify the goalposts.
Okay.
Number 2, do a gap analysis.
All right.
Number 3, look at the impacted processes. Number 4, create a list of missing elements. Number 5, operationalize. So let's do that again. Identify the goalposts, do a gap analysis, look at impacted processes, create a list of missing elements, operationalize.
So number 1, first identify the goalposts or milestones, right? So what do we jump into on that one?
So when we're starting off with identifying the goalposts, what you really want to start considering is, where do you want to be? It's very difficult to say, I want to have a transparency program when you don't know what that actually means. So do you want to have a transparency program because it meets certain legal needs, whether it's EMA requirements, Health Canada requirements, FDA requirements, or are you trying to actually go, I want to do the best, I want to do as well as what is expected from me from, say, a pharma or an AdvaMed or a bio. So one of those group organizations that has come out and said, this is what we expect from transparency. Or are you going to say that I want to be as good as my competitors? Or am I going to be better than any one of those people? Am I going to be better?
So you decide or establish where you want to be, and then you work backwards.
Correct.
Okay.
And well, you decide where you want to be. The work backwards is actually that gap analysis. So when you're doing the gap analysis, you want to say, okay, here's where I want to be. I know I'm here right now. So what you want to do now—
we're not on gap analysis yet. We're still focusing on number 1. So we're still identifying the goalposts.
Correct.
Are there any items in that we need to, or does that just describe the whole number 1? Just establish where you want to be and then work backward. Well, work backwards, we're saying, is the gap analysis, but
correct.
Did we address number 1 entirely?
Yep, we did address number 1. All we're looking for is a goalpost.
I don't know why I was expecting that to be longer. So
no.
So now that we're doing this gap analysis, where we're trying to work backwards, what does that mean?
So what that means is you now have to figure out where you know where you want to be. What you want to figure out is where you are now. So to know where you are now, you want to look at things like, what commitments have you made? You want to look at things like, what SOPs do you already have? What standard operating procedures do you already have? What kind of plans do you have to do certain things? Do you have any internal goals that you made commitments to, whether internally or externally? Those would all decide where you are. So where you are, as you said, then where the goalpost tells you where you're trying to be. And that difference between the two, the things that are missing, are part of the gap analysis. So First, identify the goalposts.
Mm-hmm.
Second is do the gap analysis. The third process is actually look at impacted processes. Now, once you know where you want to be, once you know where you are, you're going to start delving in deeper. And what you're going to find out very quickly, and you aren't going to be able to do this until you finish your gap analysis, is what processes are impacted because of what you did. And what I mean by that is, if you're doing a transparency program, chances are that transparency program is going to affect your intellectual property program. So you might have a process on what kind of patenting do you do? When do you do your patenting? If you're going to put out documentation pretty quickly, you need to make sure that it doesn't affect your patent rights. You may also want to make sure that when you actually create a transparency program, that connects to your publication program. So you may be publishing articles in JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine, but the truth is that if you disclose things as part of your transparency program, and it wasn't already disclosed in JAMA or in New England Journal of Medicine, you might have a problem because they may refuse to publish it. So you need to make sure that it connects with those. You also want to make sure that it connects with the Sunshine Act, because the types of people you will be working with may often have payments that are due under the Sunshine Act, and that type of analysis needs to be considered. Are there payments, and is the transparency itself, whether it's through publication or not, going to be considered a type of payment? Is going to be something to consider, and that's your Sunshine Act. And all of these things have to come in under the ambit of the compliance program. So make sure that you're getting buy-in from your legal and compliance team as you do this, obviously with regulatory as well. So that's your step number 3.
Okay.
Still making sense, Major?
So, yeah, we identify the goalpost. Now we're creating a this is case study. This is a case study of a transparency strategy, right? That's what we're talking about. So
Correct.
You want to first identify the goalpost, decide or establish where you want to be, and then you want to work backwards with the gap analysis. And
Correct.
after you do the gap analysis, you take a look at the gap, which I would assume that the gap analysis considers the impacted processes.
So that's a common misconception. That's a common misconception, because the gap analysis theoretically, ideally, would consider the impacted processes. The reason I split them up is because you don't know the impacted processes until you know what you already have. So it's technically almost like a 2A as opposed, or 2B, if you will, instead of a clear 2, because you don't know what the impacted processes are until you look at the SOPs and they go, refer to this program, refer to this program, refer to this program. And then that becomes an additional list you create as you're going through this process to go, oh, this is everything else I need to consider. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, okay. So you don't really know, like you said, you just don't know what's impacted until you see what the SOPs reference.
Or the commitments reference or the plans reference. Yes, very much so.
So each of those elements will reference something. It's a big network tree, right? It's like a network diagram. You kind of want to make sure that you have all your assets in a row. But then you look at those processes. After you realize what those processes are, you then dive into those to see how those are impacted or how those can be impacted with the strategy, with the transparency strategy. So after you do that, then are we finished? I mean, can we just start?
No.
Going?
So once you finish that, you now create a list of missing elements. So you've created this list of things that you know you have, things that you know are impacted. Now you create a list of missing elements. What you may discover at this point is that this list of missing elements is not just within the transparency program. You may have it within your publications programs, inside your intellectual property program, inside your compliance program. And once you start doing all of this, what you realize, you've got to get buy-in from not just one team, from multiple teams. And that's where you spend a lot of time negotiating with these different groups to make sure that what you come up with is something they can all live with. Because in the end, it's one company living with one policy. Once you get that in place, you reach step number 5, which is operationalizing. And that's a whole new ballgame about how do you operationalize the transparency program. So Major, you want to go through the 5 elements?
Sure. So number 1, you need to identify. Now, these are the 5 elements of the transparency case study, right? So we want to, number 1, identify the goalposts, or establish where you want to be. Then you want to work backwards with the gap analysis. And then you want to look at the impacted processes. And you don't know what's impacted until you see what those commitments SOPs, those internal goals and plans reference when you do that gap analysis. So once you have the gap analysis finished, you look at and you have a list, or you know what your impacted processes are. Then you want to get a list together of the missing elements, and not only that, but you want to get buy-in from the different departments, right?
Yep, exactly.
And then you move into the operationalize step, which is not the preparation step. It's not the strategy. I mean, there is definitely strategy, I'm sure, in the operationalizing, but in general, this is just the case study of the pre-execution.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a hint about what that operationalizing looks like. But if people have questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to talk to you about each of these. But operationalizing, you often want to consider with starting off with your 50,000, 100,000 foot view, and that might just be creating a transparency policy, because that transparency policy is going to have a major impact on whether a lot of these medical journals will even publish your studies, because they will expect certain transparency programs to be in place, certain commitments to be made, and that's going to be a huge part of how you operationalize. Then you're going to get into the details of how that overall policy translates, and we can talk about that in this or future podcast.
Here's a question for you. So among these 5 steps, or these which of these 5 steps is the most time consuming? Now, I would assume well, let's talk about the first 4, because the 5th step is really a different process in of itself. Well, it's a larger process, but through steps 1 through 4, which of those is the biggest time sink?
So I find that the biggest time sink is really getting a handle on where you are, because often going to different places and people you didn't even know were making commitments for you, and then going, okay, let's pull it all together. And that process of internally finding out what you've already put out, so that you can create the appropriate gap analysis, that's a huge time sink.
Step 2 though is where that is, right? So that's the gap analysis.
Step 2 and 3 is where you've got a huge time sink, but also the buy-in process, because you're now going to a organization that's already functioning and telling them you need to reorganize yourself because of this whole new process that's come in, and that takes a lot of time as well. The elements associated with figuring out the goalposts or finding the missing elements is a lot easier than those other pieces. And you want someone who can guide you through that process.
Okay. All right. So transparency case study. Number 1, first identify the goalpost. You want to establish where you want to be, then work backwards with the gap analysis. That's number 2. And that's where you I guess establish the elements, right? The commitments, the SOPs, the internal plans and goals. And then you look at the impacted processes, which is what you've discovered during the gap analysis. You create a list of missing elements, then you get the buy-in before you operationalize. Is there anything else, or does that cover everything?
I think that's a good jump off point. Question is what happens after. Reach out to us, we'll tell you more.
Thanks, guys.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast. Regulatory Guy, Irregular Podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.